Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Lamed Tet. Today's stuff is sponsored by Judith Shapiro in loving memory of her brother David Teichman, Zichrono Lebracha, on his 11th yahrzeit. He was a passionate Zionist and wonderful uncle to my children. We're going to get started. I just want to thank Rabbanit Leah Sarna for a great class, and it was good to get some good feedback this morning just before we started. So if you missed it, don't worry. It'll be up later today on Accessible. You just have to go into the course website, register. The easiest way to do that is with a Google account if you have a Gmail account. And then you can access all the materials. The slideshow should be there also, which is also very useful. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. At the bottom of Kuf Lamed Chen Bet, we have a Mishnah. Ha'av tolesh u'ma'achil l'chol mi sheyirtzeh. This Mishnah is a continuation of the previous Mishnah. In the previous Mishnah, by the way, I just want to point out there's a study guide today. When we get to it, I will share it and we will use it. It's only on part of the daf. There was a part that was kind of complicated, so I thought it was good to organize it in a sheet. Okay, so we're continuing the previous case, and then we're going to move on to something else today, but we're continuing right now the previous case. Somebody says to his son, okay, it could really be to anyone, but the case they're really talking about is a man to his son, says, I'm giving you, in his lifetime, he says, I'm giving you from today and after I die, all my possessions or whatever it might be. Now, what we learned here is the goof, the body of it really belongs already to the son from today, but the father has the right to use it during his lifetime. And now we're going to see that. That's what it means. The father has full, complete rights to anything that is in that field. So he can take out anything he wants. Umashini, now we're moving to the second part of this Mishnah, the second line really, and the last line is what happens when he dies. Because remember, there's not just one son, there's more sons. If there was only one son, then he wouldn't need to give anything as a gift to the son. So, mashiniach talush hareu shel yorshin. Whatever is left, detached from the ground at the time of death, belongs to the heirs, meaning the heirs get to divide that equally. And the only thing that brother gets is the field itself and whatever is growing in that field that's attached to the ground. So the field and what's attached. But anything that was detached, that's metaltalin. That was not included in the gift. He was giving him the land, not the movables. So now the Gemara says, Talush in mechubar lo. Is this really this? Now they infer this, which is an obvious inference, which is what's talush, what's detached, right? The Mishnah only said what's detached is divided evenly among all the brothers. But it didn't say about the attached, but it was obvious that what's attached, it's not divided evenly by the brothers, but the one brother who got that as a gift, it goes to him. But that contradicts a Tosefta Ketubot. In the Tosefta Ketubot, it says, Vahatanya, and it brings the exact scenario where one brother got the land, Me'ayom la'achar mita, with one variation. The brother sold his rights to the land to somebody else before the father died. So then what happens when the father dies? What does the Tosefta say? Shamin et ha'mechubarim la'lokeach. The lokeach gets the land. However, they have to evaluate whatever is attached to the ground that's growing. They evaluate what it's worth. And the buyer who bought it from the one brother who got gifted the land has to give that money back. The buyer has to give it to all the heirs of the person. In other words, anything that was growing in the field at the time that was still attached to the ground at the time of the father's death doesn't belong to the person who bought it from the son. So you would say if it belonged to the son, which the Mishnah says it does, then it should belong to the buyer, because doesn't the buyer have the same rights as the son? So therefore, that seems to contradict our Mishnah, because it would imply that in the case of our Mishnah, all the mechubarim, all the produce that's already grown, that's still attached to the ground, should actually go to the one son and not divided among the heirs, like it seems implied from our Mishnah. So Amar Ulla lo kasha. Ulla says, no, it's actually not difficult. This isn't a difficulty because we can resolve this easily by differentiating between the cases. Kan bibno, kan ba'achil. We all know that people have a partiality to their children. It's just a known fact. And therefore, when the father gave this gift to his son, and one son over other sons, he wanted to prefer that son and wanted that son to get more. So this is a little similar, although it's not the same, as mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, right? How generous are you when you give something? So the father's going to be more generous when he gives this gift to his son, because he wants his son to have more. So the gift is given in the sense that if I die and this is in your possession, right, because you're supposed to get it from me, you're supposed to inherit it, you're even going to get everything that's attached to the ground. However, if the son sells his rights to someone else, the father never intended for some random person to have rights to that to the exclusion of his own children, because now it's all of his heirs, right, his 10 children, let's say, right, it was either the one son against the other 9. Well, he preferred that son and wants to give him more. But if that son sold his rights to some random person, well, the father never gave rights for the things that are attached to the ground. He gave the body of the land. The land was given, but not the produce. So even if it's attached to the ground, it doesn't go to the buyer. Now we're moving on to the next Mishnah. And now we're going to talk about 2 scenarios. One is where there's only sons, and one is where there's only daughters. So I'm sorry, I shouldn't say only sons, where there's sons and daughters, but the daughters aren't relevant right now when we're talking about the sons. So the sons who are going to inherit. And then the second part of the Mishnah, we're going to talk about when the daughters inherit. And what happens here is, as we all know, when someone dies, so it's supposed to be divided up, but until they divide it equally, it's in this in-between stage where it equally belongs to everybody. And sometimes, right, you need to buy food and you need to buy clothes and you need to use the money of the estate for the needs of the family. So now we're going to talk about how much we have to make sure to keep things equal. And the premise of this Mishnah is, there's a few premises, so I'll talk about a few basics, which will be helpful both for this, and we're going to finish the chapter today and start the next chapter. It'll also be helpful for the first Mishnah of the next chapter. When somebody dies, again, they leave, the money goes, if there's sons, it goes to the sons. If there's no sons, the daughters inherit. If the daughters don't inherit because they're sons, the sons have an obligation, and we learned this in the Ketubot Nukvan. Remember the part in the Ketubah, the condition, the stipulation for the daughters is that the husband agrees to support the daughters in the event of death. Okay, let's go back to the basics that we learned recently. Up till age 6, any father needs to support his daughters. From age 6 and up, the daughters are supposed to be a little bit strange, self-sufficient. Okay, they're not really, and therefore the rabbis came and said, no, the father still has to support them, but legally there's not really a legal right of the husband to support the daughters. However, he commits in the ketubah, and even if he didn't commit this, it's as if he committed, that he's going to feed the daughters, that the daughters can be fed from his estate if he dies. So even though if he's alive, he's not under an obligation to feed them, we just assume he's under a moral obligation to feed them. And again, the court does intervene if he won't feed them. So not to worry. These daughters do usually get taken care of. But legally, he's not really. And therefore, if he dies, theoretically, the estate, we're assuming the kids don't really care as much about their sisters, let's say, or whoever inherits as much as the father does. So then the father commits, don't worry, the estate will take care of it. Okay, you'll get food. So therefore, the sons have an obligation to feed the sisters or whoever inherits, right? Well, I guess, right, if there's daughters, then the daughters will inherit, if not the sons. Okay, so if the daughters inherit, well, then they don't get food supplements because they're just heirs and they inherit. The other thing to understand, the premise of this Mishnah is there's a differentiation between there's a certain basic needs that people get from the estate. So there's food, there's clothing, there's shelter, there's money for a wedding for the boys, and dowry for the girls. So the assumption here is that older children will have higher expenses for clothing, and younger children will have higher expenses for food. Okay? Not necessarily because they eat more food. Okay? They might not. Usually bigger people eat more food. But the assumption is food includes things like childcare and other things like that. So the expenses for younger children are higher actually than for younger children. Younger children are higher when it comes to what we call mizonot. And when it comes to parnasah, which is the clothing, and those expenses is actually higher for the older children. Perhaps they want to dress nicer. Perhaps it's just the cloth is longer and bigger because they're taller. So hiniach lahem hiniach banim gdolim uktanim. אין הגדולים מתפרנסים על ידי הקטנים, ולא הקטנים ניזונים על הגדולים. So being aware of this disparity in what the cost is needed to support certain things of the older ones and certain things of the younger ones, the Mishnah says things must be equal. So if he left, meaning he died, and there were younger children and older children, the Gedolim can't take money for clothing without putting aside equal amount of funding for the children, the younger children. And we can't take aside money for the younger children for their food, give them more money without putting aside equal funding for the older children. So even though their needs might not be the same, it doesn't matter. We have to make sure everything is equal. This is all before it was divided up, because they're now taking from the pot that equally belongs to all of them. Nas'u hagdolim yis'u aktanim. If the older ones get married and they spend money on their wedding, let's say they get married before the property was divided and they take money out of the estate. So yis'u aktanim, the younger ones will take money aside. We'll put it in an account for them for when they get older, and we'll take the exact same amount out so that everything is fair. However, there's one thing that's not exactly fair. If the Ktanim say to the old ones, we want to get married the same way you got married, we want the same kind of wedding, we don't want to get, shafted and get a poor wedding, ain't shomim lahem, we don't listen to them, which sounds like it contradicts what we just said, but we'll explain in a minute. Ela masha natan lahem avihem natan. Whatever the father gave those first ones, they got, it was like a gift, they got lucky, but the younger ones can't demand the same. Now, the Gemara is going to explain this, but obvious that what they're talking about is a case where the older ones got married when the father was still alive. And they got a nice wedding because the father was still alive making money. At this point, they all have to live off the estate. They can't demand the same amount of money that the wedding that the father made for the older ones is going to be at the same they're going to get the same caliber wedding. Okay, you can imagine this scenario of, brothers fight. It's not fair. I got this kind of party, you got that kind of party, right? And why should it be fair? Just because my father died, now I'm stuck, and now I have to get a poor wedding. But on the other hand, the reality is the father's not here. There's no income coming in. So yeah, you'll have to suffice with what there is. So if no one got married before, they're obviously, or whoever didn't get married before, they're obviously going to get equal. However, what happened before happened, and that has no connection. Now we're going to see the girls. If there were no boys, and the girls are going to inherit, but again, they haven't yet divided up the property. And there were some that were older, some that were younger. Same thing here. They each can't take more than their fair share without giving everybody equal portions. Everything is equal. Now, right now, we're going to assume this means the same thing as before, although we're going to see later in the Gemara they understand this sentence to mean something else. But the way we understand it right now is the older ones got married and got a dowry, right? While before we divided up the property after the father died, then the daughters, the younger ones, will get that same amount put aside for them for when they get married. If they want to get the same kind of dowry that the daughters got when the father was still alive, we don't listen to them. And now the Mishnah has this last line, Zeh chomer bebanot mibanim. This is a chumrah of daughters over sons. Now, it doesn't mean daughters to sons. It means when the father leaves only daughters to when the father leaves only sons, or also sons. Okay, so there's going to be a difference and a chumrah for the girls when there's only girls who are inheriting. Why? Shabanot nizonot alabanim ve'ein nizonot alabanot. What did I tell you before? That the daughters can demand mizonot from the sons. And then they demand what they need. So if you need a lot, you get a lot. If you need a little, you get a little. And, if you need a lot, then you get to demand a lot. But here, you can't demand a lot without giving fair, equal share to everyone else. So if you're the heirs, because there's no boys and it's only girls inheriting, then all the food is divided evenly. But if not, then you get according to your need without having to make sure everyone else gets the exact same amount as you. Comes Rava, and Rava has one exception to this rule about everything being equal and fair. I'm a Rava. Hi, gadol achi, de lavash v'ikase mi beita. If the oldest brother went out, spent money on a nice fancy suit from the estate, my David Avid, what's done is done. And we don't make all the other brothers get an equal amount. Now, why is that? Why is this oldest brother in a unique position? Because the oldest brother can claim, I need it to represent you in court, to represent you in selling the property. He's the one we assume is kind of like the executor of the will, and he's therefore needs to dress properly. This is like when you say it's a business expense, right? So he claims this is for everyone else's good, and therefore now, notice the language Rava uses. If someone did this, what's done is done. It's not saying he should go out and spend the money from the estate and use it to buy fancy clothes, but he is saying that if it was done, we're going to let it go. To which the Gemara says, but the Mishnah says you can't do that. The older ones can't, make buy something better than the younger ones. They say manitim b'shracha. The Mishnah is not talking about the oldest son who's going to represent everybody. They're talking about one who just doesn't work at all. Okay, a couch potato. So they say shracha pshita. Obviously, if he's a couch potato and he's not working and he's not doing anything, of course, we're not going to let him spend more money on his clothing than anybody else. Why would you even think that? Why would the Mishnah need to tell you that? Well, this is fascinating. You might have thought, it's only a hypothetical suggestion, but you might have thought that it was in the brother's best interest that they don't have this one brother who has no job, who doesn't do anything, who has no money to afford his own clothing, will be walking around looking despicable. It reflects poorly on them, which isn't good for them. And therefore, maybe he could have a claim, I need the money more than you. I'm going to take more money to buy myself nice clothing. Mashmalan, no. Comes to teach you no. That we don't make any distinctions. Only the oldest brother, if he's representing the brothers, can he take it as kind of an office, a business expense, but other than that, really not. And that's because it's in everybody's interest. And even though this maybe is in their interest, it's not a strong enough interest that their brother not walk around looking like a schlump. This is just going to explain where I wanted to, as I translated, I first translated in a way it wasn't so clear to show you why the Gemara has to explain this to you, but we already know what this means. My kamar, what does this mean? Amar Rabbi Yehuda hachi kamar. What it means is this: Nasug dolim lachar mitata bihen. If they got married after the father died, then yisuk tanim lachar mitata again. And before it was divided, then yisuk tanim lachar mitata bihen. So if some got married, right, they would get money. We would put aside the same amount of money for the younger ones. Aval nasug dolim b'chaya bihen. But if they got married when the father was still alive, and then the younger ones say after the father's death, it's not fair. We want to get the same amount of money. We want to have the same wedding that you had. We can't give in to that request. Whatever the father gave them, he gave them. In other words, meaning whatever the older ones, they lucked out that they had this nice wedding, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the younger ones are going to be able to demand the same. Okay, now we get to the complicated part of today's sugya. And we're going to ask a totally different question. This is on the words hiniach banot gdolot uktanot, and really what we're going to focus in on is the words nasu gdolot yisu ktanot, which we thought meant if the older ones got married and again after the father's death, before they divided the inheritance and got a dowry, we're going to make sure the younger ones get the exact same dowry. But soon we'll see that that's not the way the Mishnah is understood. But we're going to get to it from a totally different place. Shalach le'avua bar Geneva leRabba. So the father, Avua bar Geneva, his name was Avua, the son of Geneva, says to Rabba, Yilamdenu Rabbeinu, can you please teach me the following halacha? Lavta va'achla va'amda v'niseit. A woman borrows money. She's single. She borrows money. She uses all the money. She has no money left, but she has property. And then she goes and gets married. Now, what's the problem? Well, she took out money. She took out a loan. But it was a loan that was oral, milva al peh. Now, milva al peh cannot get collected from nechasim mishuabadim, lien property, which means property she sold to someone. So if she sells her property to someone and she's got no cash left or no movables, they can't collect the loan. Okay, they can only collect it from what's called nechasim necholim. What's the reason for that? It's very important to understand, certainly for later in the sugya as well. Because when someone goes to buy land, they have to check, are there any loans out? Are there any, commitments that person has? Because any commitments, can be collected. But only commitments that are documented. Because when the person goes to buy land, they have to check what's in the system. Is there a lien on this property? If it was an oral loan, we assume nobody knows about it. If nobody knows about it, well, then the person who bought the land, it's unfair to them that there should be a lien on this property and it'll get taken away from them. The idea is that when they go in, they know whether it has a lien, whether it doesn't. It probably affects the price of the land. If it has a lien, well, maybe they'll be able to pay a little less money because they'll know that it might get taken away. So there has to be what we call full disclosure. There's no full disclosure when it's an oral loan. So she took out this loan and then she got married. Now, in this case, she didn't sell her property, but what happened? When she got married, what happens to her property? The husband, remember, nichse malo, the use of her property that is hers already, let's say she inherited from her father, that property goes into the marriage and the husband has rights to all the proceeds. She owns the goof of the land, but he gets all the proceeds. And in the event that she dies, he inherits the property and it becomes fully his, everything. So the question is, how do we treat the husband? Ba lokech havi o yoresh havi? Is he like a buyer, a purchaser, or is he like an heir? Now, what's the relevance? Well, lokech havi, if he's a buyer, then it goes back to what I said. Milva al pe'eno goveh mina lekuchot, right? This would basically mean that if you were going to loan money to someone who's a single woman, you should think twice, because if she doesn't pay it back, she's going to go get married. And then her husband is like, if he's viewed like a purchaser, then you'll never get this loan back unless she has cash on hand. If she doesn't have cash on hand or movables, and she sold her land, right? Then, well, not that she sold her land, sorry. Just by marrying her husband, all her land becomes her husband's property. And he's like a buyer, even though at this point he doesn't actually, this is what I was checking before class, it's even if he doesn't inherit her down the road. We're not even talking about when she dies and it all goes to her. We're talking about both when she dies and it all goes to him if she dies first, or even at the time of the marriage, he is like as if he purchased the land, even though she still has the goof of the karka, right? The body of it is hers, but it's as if he purchased it. So that's one side. Maybe. We don't know. That's the question. Is he a purchaser? If he's a purchaser, this person will never get their loan back. Again, assuming she has nothing left. In this case, achla, she ate it all. She has nothing left. All she has is her land, and her land went to her husband. And if he's a buyer, well, can't take it out of his hands because, again, it's a milva al peh, it's an oral loan. Oral loan can't be collected from sold property. Oh, Dilma, or maybe yoresh havi, or maybe he's just viewed like an heir, like the way an heir would inherit property. His relationship to his wife's property is like he inherited it. Umilva al peh goveh mina yorshim, and an oral loan you can collect from yorshim. Now, why is this? This the rabbis instituted as a takana. They said that if we didn't allow loans to be collected from heirs, nobody would lend money to anybody. And then that's a problem because we want people to be able to get loans. Because they'd say, well, if you die and I can't collect it from your heirs, I'll never have a way to collect it. So the rabbi said, no. You can collect loans from heirs. So if he's viewed like an heir, then the lender would be able to, the creditor could collect the loan. So that's the big question. For this big question, we're going to have several attempts to answer it. The first attempt, we're going to start with our Mishnah. Amarle, Tanina, we can learn from our Mishnah. Nasuk dolot, yesuk tanot. Now, what does that have to do with anything? The way we read this has nothing to do with anything. This doesn't answer the question. Because nasuk dolot, according to the way we read it, means if the older ones get married and get a dowry after the father died, yesuk tanot, the younger ones will get that same amount. Okay, this had absolutely nothing to do with the husband inheriting property. But the Gemara first assumes, okay, and this is actually Rava. Rava answered this question because he was the one who was asked the question. Remember this because Rava later is going to say the opposite. And I'll already tell you where this is going, and I'll share my screen for a minute. Here. Okay. So what we're going to do here is say, right, we're going to try to answer and say he's like a Yoresh, like an heir. And Rava says, let's learn it from a Mishnah. My lab, is it not read like this? Nas'u gedolot libal, if they got married to a husband, yis'u ktanot mibal. If they got married, the older ones got married to a husband and took too much money, more than they should have, then yis'u ktanot. Now, yis'u, it's a tricky word. Yis'u could mean to marry. Yis'u could mean to take. So in this case, they say nas'u gedolot, if the older ones took too much, the younger ones could demand it back from the husband. So if the first nasu is they married husbands, the second is they took. The younger ones can demand it back from the husbands. Now, let's just talk about this kind of thing. Okay, and here I put it in the chart as well. Okay, so I put it here as an attempt to answer. But here we're going to put it in the chart. If you say yisuk tanot mi baal, then you say This means the ketana can collect the money back from the husband. Now, if he's a purchaser, this is like a milval pet. She's owed money from the older sister, but there's no documentation to it. The older sister just took too much money for her wedding. So, or for her dowry. So basically, the younger one can demand it back, even though it's like a milval pet. And the milval pet, you shouldn't be able to demand from a purchaser. And therefore, we're going to view him like an heir. And that's his answer. So the first attempt to reject this, we're going to have one attempt to reject it, which is going to be rejected. And then we'll have a second rejection, really, of the answer. So the first attempt to reject won't be successful. And the first attempt is to basically say, why don't we just read the Mishnah the way we read it? And then it has nothing to do with this. So they're going to answer, right? Ini. Sorry, I skipped the line. Sorry, Amrle Tanina. Okay, lo. The Gemara says no. Nasuk dolot leba'al, yasuk tanot leba'al. What do you mean? Read the Mishnah the way we thought it was read. Nasuk dolot to a husband, right? They get married, they take a dowry. The younger ones will take exactly the same amount for when they get married. But the Gemara says, Ini, how can you read the Mishnah that way? Even though that's how we read the Mishnah, but Hatani Rabbi Chia brought a braita basically explaining our Mishnah, and his version read, Nasuk dolot leba'al, yasuk tanot mi ba'al. So you can't say that it doesn't mean what we just said it meant, because his version is if they married and took too much money, then the younger ones can take the money from the husband, which really does seem to imply that it's like a yoresh. Now, again, I want this to be very clear why it's like a yoresh, and I wrote it here in Hebrew, but I'll explain it in the chart, which is if he's like a purchaser, then the younger ones can't demand what they're owed by the older sisters from the husband because it already changed hands and he's a purchaser. It's like they sold it. And once they sold it, this is like a milval peh. It's like an oral arrangement. Why is it? Now, this is the key. Why is it like an oral arrangement? Because there was no documentation. And if there's no documentation, now how does it work? Let's just remember, when there's no documentation, right? The purchaser, in this case, just the husband who's inheriting, but he's like a purchaser. Purchaser has no knowledge of what's coming, right? No knowledge that there was a loan out. So there would be no reason. Okay? He wouldn't know, and therefore it wouldn't be fair, and therefore you can't collect it from him. That's the general reason. So now the Gemara is going to reject this and say, wait a minute. You could say it's like a lokach, but this is an exception to the rule. And why is it an exception to the rule? So the Gemara says, Dil mashane parnasa di lakala. Parnasa here means the nedunya. She gets money for the nedunya, the younger one, right? And the older one took too much money and she's owed money back for her nedunya. She can demand it from the husband. Why? Because he knew going into it that this was coming. Everybody knows. You don't need a star to say it. Everybody knows that she's going to get a dowry. So he knew going into it that she's deserving of this money. So it's not like a milval pet, and then therefore you can't really compare it to this case. Okay, so now we really have no way of knowing from our Mishnah. Okay, so we had two possibilities why we have no way of knowing, even though one was really rejected. And this is why I put it in the chart here to just summarize. And we can even start from the last one. If you say Yisuk Tanot Libal, well, then this isn't connected at all because this has nothing to do with collecting money. So we need a case where someone's collecting money from someone else who is viewed like a purchaser or an heir, right? That's the whole question. If you go with the first version, what we thought the Mishnah meant, it has nothing to do with it. And even if you go with the version the Gemara suggested to say is a yoresh, no. Because in the end, we differentiate between, and that's why I put this little chart within the chart, the case of the marrying and the nedunya not getting enough money, there's a kol. The case of the borrowing, where she borrowed and there was no document, there was no kol. And therefore, even if here he's like a lokach and we could collect, it doesn't necessarily mean that we could collect in the other case because they're not comparable cases. So in the end, the first attempt is not a good answer. However, we're now going to have two more answers. Okay, I wrote here, the conclusion is the maskana, ein lemomi mishatenu kadei lanot ala sheila, and the Mishnah doesn't give us any indicator what the answer is. Now we're going to have another attempt to answer that it's kiyoresh, and we're actually going to bring two different sources to prove this, okay, two different answers. So, and it's going to be a bit of a conversation format. So, and I didn't put answer 1, 2, 3, even though I could have, because it sort of comes about in different ways. Like we're going to have another answer. So this really is the second attempt to answer. And then Abai is going to say, why did you learn it from there? You could have learned it from there, which is sort of a third answer, but I wanted to write it more as Abai's response to Rav Papa. So it's kind of in the end, there's three answers. The first one rejected, the second two will be accepted till we raise some contradiction to them. But that's the structure. So Amar le Rav Papa le Rav. Lav hainu deshalach Ravin beigarte. So Rav Papa says to Rava, why are you stressing out trying to figure out an answer to this? Isn't this just like Ravin sent in a letter saying the following halacha? Okay. It's interesting. In our Masechah, we've had a ton of these letters being sent. Maybe because it's such a relevant issue, Yerusha, right? That it was always, there were tons of cases going on. Mishamate v'yiniach almana ubat. So someone dies and leaves over no sons, just a widow and a daughter. Almanatoni zonim midachasav. So even though the daughter inherits, the almana, the widow, gets food from the inheritance. Nisei tabat, what if she gets married? Well, if he's now, the fact is, okay, this is another Mishnah that you need to know from Gitin. In almana and the daughters can only get fed from free property, not lien property. So if the property of the father was sold to someone else, they can't get mizono. Why not? Because no one would ever buy land knowing that down the road they're going to have to, the land's going to be taken away to feed the widow and the daughters, because food is like davar she'en lo sof, right? It's going to keep going on for years and years. There's no fixed amount. Okay. Whereas a ketubah, let's say, is a fixed amount. So you know going in, there's a ketubah here. Okay. So you're going to have to pay a certain amount of money. If the husband doesn't have that money in his estate, when he dies, they'll take it from the land you bought from that guy. That's a fixed amount. But when it's a monthly supplement that could go who knows how long, the widow never remarries, it'll be forever, right? If she remarries, someone else is responsible. The estate doesn't pay anymore. But if she's not married, she gets, or there are all these things we learned in Ketubot. Once she starts putting on makeup, once she starts, right, when she gets engaged, once she starts claiming she wants her Ketubot, whatever it is. But it could be who knows how long. So you can't collect that from lien property. Now, what do you see here? If the daughter gets married, you can collect it from the husband. So what does that show you? He's not a buyer. If he was a buyer, you wouldn't be able to collect it. And furthermore, he said, Meita habat, if once the daughter dies and he really inherits it, Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Achotosha Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, Rabbi Yehuda, who was the nephew of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, his sister's son, Al Yadi Hayama said there was a case that happened with me, and even then, he had to pay. So what do you see here? He's like a Yoresh. If he was a buyer, he wouldn't have to pay. Iyamar, and that's the Gemara is going to explain. Iyamar Bishlama Yoresh have Mishum Hachi Amanutoni Zanam Nechasav. Right? So that all makes sense. If he's a Yoresh, then you would say it. If Iyamar Lokech Have Amayni Zanam Nechasav, because we know an Amana does not take money from lien property. And that would be lien property because he bought it from her. So that's his proof to Yoresh. To which Abaye says, again, this is why I said I didn't say this is a third answer but it really is. It's just coming as a reaction, more like he's reacting to Rav Papa, and he says to him, if Ravin hadn't sent that letter, what we wouldn't have known? It's a simple Mishnah. In other words, why are you going complicated and getting into something an Amora sent in a letter? Why don't you just simply say it says it in the Mishnah? Let's see the Mishnah. It's a Mishnah Bechorot. Because it has to do with the Bechor. These are things that are not returned in the Jubilee year. If you remember, you buy land, it goes back in the Jubilee year. But not the Bechorah. The double portion the Bechor gets does not revert back in the Jubilee year. Turning now to Amabet, and someone who inherits his wife. Now, if he's a purchaser, every land you purchase goes back in the Jubilee year to the original owner. But a husband inherits his wife, it doesn't go back in the Jubilee year. We know this because that was the whole problem with Benot Tzlachad. If they inherited and then got married and their husbands would inherit their property, if they were from a different tribe, they would take the land away, it would go to some other tribe. So, and forever, otherwise it wouldn't be such a problem if it went back in the Jubilee year. So anyway, the point being here, that was just an aside I was telling you, the point being here, and by the way, the Rashbam says this is someone who holds that the Yerusha of the husband is doraita. Otherwise, it really would go back. There's a machloket about that, whether the husband inherits the wife on a doraita level or not, but we're not going to get into all that right now. Point being, he inherits his wife and it doesn't go back in the Jubilee year. He is a Yoresh and not a purchaser. So basically, Abaye's question is, why did you bring it from a Ravin sent? You could have just brought it from this Mishnah. And Rav Papa doesn't answer. But comes Rava, and has a problem with Rav Papa and theoretically also with Abaye. He just attacks Rav Papa with it. Amar le Rava, Bahashta deshalach miyadina. He says, it's very nice you said Rabban sent this. And from Rabban's words, it sounds like, okay, let's just go back for a minute. We'll put up the sheet, right? So we have this clear because it's a little bit confusing. Rabban had this whole thing about the someone dies, right? The alman nizonet, and that proves he's an heir. Now, Hama Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, but I'm going to bring you a different source. The Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina says, Be'usha hitkinu, in Usha, which was where the Sanhedrin went, Hayisha shemachra nichsei malog b'chaye ba'ala v'meta, haba'al motzi miyada lekuchot. What we're going to show is that in Usha, and basically what Rav is saying here, that there's a contradiction in what Rav Papa said. Because this other source indicates that the husband is like a purchaser, a buyer. How so? If the woman sells her nichsei malog while the husband is still alive, right? So what is she selling? This is like the hayom ulachar mita. She's selling her rights to the goof of the land. The problem is, what if she dies? If she dies, the husband's supposed to inherit her. So is it too late though, because she already sold it? So if we view him as a buyer, then he could say, I bought it before you bought it. Because when I got married to her, I purchased this land. You want to claim you purchased it? Right now, I can take it away from you because I bought it before you. If he's an heir, then it's like he gets it only at the moment of death. At the moment of death, it's too late. It already went to the purchasers because they purchased the rights to it for when she died, and then he wouldn't be able to take it from the purchasers. So here it says, he can take it from whoever bought it, which shows that he's a buyer. If he wasn't a buyer, he would have no rights to take it away from them. So basically, Rava, and this is why I wanted to point this out, Rava in the beginning was the first one to try to answer the question and said he's like a yoresh. He's like an heir. But now Rava says, wait a minute. It seems like this source seems to indicate where Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said about Usha sounds like he's a lokech. So now we have a problem because we had two sources. It's a yoresh, right? The first one we rejected, but the other two are good. One is about the Yovel. It goes back in the Jubilee year. I'm sorry, it doesn't go back in the Jubilee year, which means he's an heir. And once the daughter dies, or even if she's married, the almanah gets the mizona. And that would only be if he's an heir. However, in Usha, it sounds like he's a buyer. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to take it away from anyone who bought it. So comes Rav Ashi after this whole long sugya. Is he a yoresh? Is he a lokech? We're going to have a very interesting type of answer. Ela Amar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi now comes and explains. Baal shavinu Rabbanan ki yoresh, v'shavinu Rabbanan ki lokech. Behechad detavale avdule. Fascinating answer. Sometimes the rabbis viewed the husband as an heir. Sometimes the rabbis viewed him as a purchaser. And really what they did is wherever was good for him, they said, whichever way worked better for him, we're going to go that way. Now, it's not exactly true. We're going to have to deal with the statement because it's not always better for him. But let's go through. Okay. And the Gemara is going to help us. Okay. So that we don't have to do it ourselves. Now we're going to go one by one. Gabei Yovel. And I did it here not in the order that we learned the sugyo because Yovel was Abaye who responded to Rav Papa. That was answer number 3. But they're going to start with answer number 3. Then we're going to go to answer number 4, which was the contradiction of Rava, where we said he's a lokech. And then we're going to go back to the second answer of Rav Papa about the almanah getting mizonot. And you'll see in a minute why they go in that order. Gabei Yovel shavinu Rabbanan ki yoresh mishum seda didei. So again, what did they say? Whenever it's in his best interest. Well, Yovel is obviously in his best interest that it remain in his property. And therefore, he's like a yoresh. And the reason is so that he doesn't lose out and his land doesn't go back. If he was a purchaser, the land would go back. Gabei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina shavinu Rabbanan ki lokech mishum seda didei. If she sells her nichsei malog and then she dies, he can take it from the likuchot. That's obviously in his best interest, so he doesn't lose his land. So he gets to demand it from the likuchot, from the purchasers. So again, here you see, in one case, making him a yoresh is in his best interest. In this case, making him a purchaser is in his best interest so that he can get the land back from anyone who purchased it from the wife. But let's go back now to the other one. The Rabbin, the one that Rabbin sent in the letter that Rav Papa quoted, Mishum Seder de Almana Shavinu Rabbanan Ki Yoresh. Here, we're not worried about him losing out. Actually, he loses out. But we're going to make him a Yoresh so as not to make the widow lose out. Now, why is this? Because while it's true we want to help the husband, on the other hand, we want to help the widow. Why? Because the husband is going to lose out. Because the husband is going to lose out. And the widow 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 is going to widows are always considered people that we need to help. So since we have to help the widow, we're going to basically call him a Yoresh so that the halacha sides on her side. So that's why I said it's not exactly, and that's why this one came last, because it doesn't exactly fit perfectly with the words of Ravashi. Ravashi said, Hecha detavule avdule. Whatever was best for the husband, that's what they did. This one isn't best for the husband, but it's best for her. Now, the Gemara asks a question, not exactly that, because I think that's kind of obvious, but what they do ask in the same vein is, well, if you're taking into consideration the widow, the Gemara doesn't say this, but I assume that's what they mean. What about taking into consideration the loss of the people who purchased the land from the woman in the Takanav Usha? They purchased land, and it's one thing to say what's good for him, but what's good for him is bad for someone else. So why are we siding on the husband's side and not on the purchaser's side? It should be unfair that they should lose out. To which they answer, no. Hatam inu afsiduhu an afsidu an afshayu. They cause their own loss. Why is that? They should never have bought land from a woman who was married, whose husband had rights to her property, and who's going to eventually inherit. In other words, they knew what they were getting into in the first place. They knew it was a risky transaction. And therefore, we're not worried about them because they put themselves in this risky transaction. They should never have bought something that wasn't fully somebody's because the husband still had rights to it and was possibly going to inherit. So that's why we don't side on their side. And with that, Hadran alach yesh no chali. Okay, with that, we finish the chapter and we'll start the new chapter. Now we get to a fascinating sugya. There'll be a gefet on it, hopefully coming out in the next day or so, which is really a gefet on using this as an example for how do we paskin halacha from a sugya. And we're going to see there's a lot of different opinions here, and it's a very, very important issue. Now, this relates to something we talked about earlier. Somebody dies and leaves sons and daughters. So what happens? The sons inherit, but the daughters get mizono. So when there's a lot of property and enough to go around, so the boys inherit and they support the girls. What if there's not enough money? And the first question of the Gemara is going to be, what does it mean enough, not enough? Okay, that's the big question everybody always asks, right? What does it mean I have enough money to live on? If there's not enough money, we use the estate only to feed the girls, and the boys have to go around asking for charity. And that's why it's a huge question. How much is not enough money? Okay, because there could be enough money right now, but we're worried in the future there won't be enough money, and these kids might have to be knocking on doors, even though there's actually money in the estate. So it's a very important question. Admon Omer, okay, this is the feminist for men. I don't know if there's a word for that, but Admon comes along and says, Bishvil shani zachar hifsadati, what, just because I'm male, I'm going to lose out? Like, that's unfair. I have to go knocking on doors because we have to support the girls. What about me? It's unfair. Okay, we're going to have to understand what exactly his question is. We'll get to this. You might remember we actually learned this sugya before. It comes up in Ketubot. Ano Rabban Gamliel ro'ani etivrei Admon. And then Rabban Gamliel says, Admon seems to make the most sense to me. Now, this would indicate, and this is where Rabbanit Chana goes in Gefet, which shall have it, we'll do it in English. It's not in yet, but basically so it sounds like we hold like Admon. However, the sugya is going to indicate that we hold the other way. So it's very tricky and hard to figure out because the fact that Rabban Gamliel, and the truth is there's another sugya that says anytime Rabban Gamliel says Ro'ani Divrei Admon, this is not the only time we hold like him. So it's a little tricky because not everybody holds like him here. So it's an interesting topic in and of itself, but off the daf. So we're going to go on. Bekama merubim. What does it mean? A lot of money. There has to be enough money for everyone to be supported for a whole year. The girls to get their food and needs, and the boys to get their food and needs. 1 year's worth, that means there's a lot. And then already the boys get to get. But, right, and if there's not enough for 1 year, then the boys have to go knocking on doors. But Kiamarita Kamei Dishmol, and this happens a lot. Rav Yehuda quotes what Rav said, because he learned by Rav. After Rav died, he moves to Shmuel's Beit Midrash. When he gets to Shmuel's Beit Midrash, he tells him all these things that Rav said, and Shmuel says, what? Amar zo divrei Rabban Gamliel bar Rebbe. That's what Rabban Gamliel says. Aval chachamim omrim. The rabbis don't agree with that definition. The rabbis say kadesh yizono mehen elu ve'elu ad sheyivgilu. The girls get mizonon until what point? By law, the benot nukvan actually doesn't mean they get indefinitely. They get, right? Remember, from the age of 6, theoretically, the father doesn't have to, but really, by the ketubah, from the age of 0 all the way until either they get married and then they're their husband's responsibility, or they become a bogeret, which is 12 years and a half. 12 and a half years, they already are independent. They don't get fed by they're considered that they can deal with it on their own. So says you have to have enough for all of them until the daughters get, and there has to be enough to feed the daughters until they get old enough to be independent, which could be years of money. Okay, which the Gemara is going to ask about. But Itmar Nami, Ki Ata Rabin, and also after Shmuel says this, we're told that also Rabin came and said it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, one of them quoted the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So there has to be a lot of money in the state before we can give the boys. We just make the boys knock on doors at that point. In other words, you need, let's say, 10 years worth it could be. The girls are babies, right? Need 10 years worth of food to feed them, and the boys have to go knocking at doors. So there could be a lot of money, and yet not enough. It's interesting to think about their savings in those times, right? To think they had that much money saved up is like the first opinion seems reasonable. Like how much could the father have saved up? A year's worth or something, right? The average person for sure doesn't have that much money in those days. Maybe they did. I don't know. It's just interesting to think about. Okay, so that's our daf for now. We'll do a quick review. The first thing was about when the father gives away his property, what part remains his, what part when he dies goes to all the heirs, and what part goes to the son. And then we have this contradiction, and we distinguish between if the son sold it, it would be different than if the son kept it for himself. Then we had the banim gdolim and the banim tanim and the banot gdolot and the banot tanot and how everything has to be equal. From that, we got to this question about a woman who borrows money and then gets married. Is it right? It's a milva al peh. Can they collect from the husband? Is the husband a yorish or a lokach? In the end, we didn't really have an answer. The answer became depends on the situation, because we tried to bring all these answers, and then in the end, they contradicted each other. So Rav Ashi came with the ultimate compromise and said, well, it really depends on the situation, whatever's in the best interest of the husband, or perhaps a widow. Then we go with whichever answer fits, which is a fascinating answer. And then we got to this last, also really interesting case, which we'll deal with more tomorrow, about when there's not enough money to go around, who gets it, the sons or the daughters? Why would we side with one over the other? And we'll talk about that tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day, and we'll meet up tomorrow.